All right, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time where I'm at right now is about 3:36 p.m. The date is May 13th, 2025, and this is book 11 in our Book to React series, where we read an entire text cover to cover, live on stream for the people, react to the pages. This is our first book that was requested by one of the followers. Shout out to DoorOfEl for sending this magnificent book over, Marlon B. Ross's Sissy Insurgencies, A Racial Anatomy of Unfit Manliness. This was a book written by a professor at the University of Virginia that explores effeminacy in Black men and what that means for racial politics, for society, what that means for the Black mind. It's a very deep and academic book. It's one of the more challenging books we've read on this series, and I'm looking forward to continuing to deal with the vast concepts that are in this book. And what I'm catching a lot from this book is making me just reimagine what it means to be a Black man, what it means to be masculine in this world as a man, and what that means for the Black man, because, you know, we live in a system under white supremacy where full masculineness of men, the traditional masculine roles, have always been outside of the purviews of Black men from practicing fully and completely. So I find this, to be a fascinating book, and I'm looking forward to continuing, even though it has been a rough few pages, a rough few chapters. We're in the middle of chapter 2, and it's getting more dense and more layered, and looking forward to continuing in this text. So once again, like I said, this is Marlon B. Ross's book. You can pick it up on Amazon for the humble price of only $30 paperback, $37 hardcover. But if you need a copy of those free books, holla at me and we will help you out. So we're going to be continuing in chapter 2. We were reading about manual labor and W.E.B. Du Bois's attacks on Booker T. Washington for his stance that Black men should just be focused on work and building themselves up economically rather than just demanding their rights as they are as men. And a lot of W.E.B. Du Bois's criticism of Booker T. Washington came from Booker T. Washington, once again, his stance on this, but also W.E.B. Du Bois framing his attacks as an attack on Booker T. Washington's masculinity, basically framing it that Booker T. Washington wants to be the woman to the white man. He wants to be the white man's helper in the same way a woman is a man's helper, essentially. So, yeah, there was a lot of a negative framing that W.E.B. Du Bois did on Booker T. Washington's ideology, and we're going to be continuing here on page 72 in the PDF and page 61 in the text if you have the book and following along. Let's continue here. So, there is no doubt that Miller is rebutting Du Bois's highly influential attack on Washington's manhood in Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others. What is made to be a liability in Du Bois's characterization of Washington's gender positioning is here turned into a supreme performance of manliness. Through his attack on Trotter, Miller is able to warn his friend Du Bois to back away from his flirtations with Trotter. Miller does so by turning Du Bois into an innocent victim of Trotter's machinations. We wove a subtle net about W.E.B. Du Bois, the brilliant writer and scholar, and gradually weaned him from his erstwhile friendship from Mr. Washington, so as to exploit his prominence and splendid powers in behalf of the hostile forces. Casting Du Bois as the seduced maiden of Trotter's wily machinations, Miller uses language that praises Du Bois while also insinuating a certain immaturity, his being weaned from one camp to another in comparison to Washington's power of enlargement. In contrast with Washington's equability of temper, Du Bois's tendency toward fine frenzy makes him a moving writer, but an impotent and incompetent race leader. Ironically, Miller turns Du Bois's aggressive bid for manhood rights in souls into a sad and bitter wail, as he picks up on the elegiac, effusive, lachrymose prose as a benchmark of the author's true nature as a fragile man of frenzied contemplation. his mind being cast in a weird and fantastic mold. His place is the cloister of the reflective scholar. He lives behind the veil, and whenever he emerges to mingle with the grosser affairs of life, we may expect to hear, ever and anon, that sad and bitter wail. Associating Du Bois with the ivory tower and the cloister, Miller himself, an ivory-towered intellectual at Howard University, also puns on one of Du Bois's most famous figures of speech, the veil, which Du Bois used to connote the dark side of race oppression experienced in Jim Crow, as well as the torn drape dividing the sacred temple, but which Miller exploits as an effeminizing trope, the veil that chaste, cloistered women wear to protect them from the grosser affairs of life. Incapable of functioning in the rough and tumble world of bare-knuckle politics that Washington has enlarged himself to master, Du Bois's métier consists of a smaller, more delicate sphere of the emotive and the poetic, the very place that Howells views as a natural to the tenderer temperament of the Negro. So basically trying to say here that W.B. Du Bois, even though he was attacking Booker T. Washington's manhood by saying that your strategy of making black folks just get educated and start businesses and stuff will make them women to the white man, this person here is attacking Du Bois and saying that, all Du Bois has is words. He's saying that he's more, or his ideas are more masculine than Booker T. Washington's. But really all he does is write fancy words and poetry like a woman, right? Like to some degree, like an effeminate woman. All he can do is rattle in his pages of his books that only a few intellectuals read to actually make a shake in the world. But actually he is not a leader of men like Booker T. Washington to some degree. All right, continuing here. This contentious debate over Washington's fitness for leadership reveals how gender deportment complicates the framing of political prowess under early Jim Crow, when Trotter's verbal attack on Washington's manhood ultimately leads to the former's use of physical force. Miller's distinction between a brutish and an equitable manliness would seem to carry some weight. We must not overlook the deeper implication of these verbal skirmishes over manhood sapping. Verbally punking a political opponent necessarily implies a dimension of physical violence if the jeopardy represented by the leader's sapping of manhood is seen as endangering the safety and survival of the race. While with lynching rising in the first decade of the 20th century, Trotter's resort to physical force could well be understood as justified. Sycophancy hardly seems equipped to end white men's lynching violence. In the eyes of Washington's opponents, the prospect of a sissy leader makes the race more vulnerable to harassment and violation. Although punking a political adversary in the United States has historically been practiced mainly by men against men, as Jackson Katz's Man Enough has documented, through a history of the masculinist rhetoric used in U.S. presidential campaigns, the unmanning dynamic of the tactic does not necessarily disappear when a woman enters the fray, especially when the woman is as forceful an activist as Ida B. Wells. In her autobiography, Wells does not pull any punches against the wizard. She charges Washington with employing sneaky tactics in the interest of sucking up to the white northern philanthropist rather than from any genuine principle of black people's intrinsic political strength. According to Wells, Washington's sycophancy accords with his theory that we ought not to spend our time agitating for our rights, that we had better give attention to trying to be first-class people in a Jim Crow car than insisting that the Jim Crow car should be abolished. Like Trotter and Du Bois, Wells charges Washington with robbing the race of its manhood. When the Chicago Black literati met to discuss Du Bois's Souls on his publication in 1903, Wells and her husband stand alone in defending Du Bois's argument against the 4 other members of the book club. We thought it was up to us to show them the sophistry of the reasoning that any one system of education could fit the needs of an entire race, that to sneer at and discourage higher education would mean to rob the race of leaders which it so badly needed, and that all the industrial industrial education in the world could not take the place of manhood. Although Wells's forceful stance is authentically voiced as her own, her concern for Washington's sapping the race's manhood is also own with her husband. As Patricia A. Schrechter observes, Du Bois and Wells had a shared understanding of the race's manhood. Schrechter captures the gender ambivalence at work in Wells's use of the manhood weapon. On the one hand, the call to manhood summoned the common humanity of all African Americans, much as the concept of the brotherhood of man invoked the ungendered dignity of all members of the human family. On the other hand, manhood cannot be divorced from the prerogative of a privileged masculinity. Although a woman could hardly be accused of being a sycophant in the way Du Bois lobs the charge, any more than a woman can be a sissy. A woman's political leadership is just as much in jeopardy of being charged with gender inappropriateness, often through dismissive mockery, rather than with the sort of violent alarm we see in these men's punking attacks and counterattacks. Despite the certain backlash to such unfeminine rhetoric and conduct, Jacqueline Goldsby observes that Wells also sounds pleased by the prospects of violating the gendered expectations for race women activists. In this sense, we would consider Wells an analogous case to the Sissy Washington, as she, according to Goldsby, claims the mantle of masculine authority to achieve a level of public visibility otherwise beyond her reach. Schrechter points out that Wells's role of race woman led many African American men to dismiss her assertive female behavior as tedious and overreaching. Washington himself strikes back, notably in a private letter, charging that Wells is fast making herself so ridiculous that everybody is getting tired of her. Although Washington is careful to avoid entangling himself in these punking tactics in public, he is well aware of the risks they pose to his reputation, as his bid to sue Trotter for libel indicates. As Schrechter records, Washington and his followers ridiculed militants' manhood hysteria and argued that economic self-sufficiency and attention to moral duties demonstrated the true manhood first necessary to earn political rights in the future. Evidently, Washington's followers want to emphasize the discordancy between manhood and hysteria as ostensibly a female malady by placing manhood in quotation marks within the phrase, indicating the alarm that accompanies any deviation from the masculine norm, as I discussed in Chapter 1. Thus, Washington's advocates attempt to normalize Washington's own public gender practice by projecting an unmanly hysteria onto his opponents. So very interesting stuff here. Basically, what I take from this is that a lot of the attacks on Booker T. Washington were about the idea of manhood, right? That I guess it's hard for us to understand now, but maybe it still exists today. The idea that the black race needed leadership. I guess this was during the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century, when the idea of great men leading history was still very prevalent. We need strong men to lead us, great intellectual thinkers. And when we say men, we mean explicitly men who demonstrate the most masculine of behaviors and the best moral uprightness, right? And so, the critiques on Washington were about strategy, but they were crouched in a lot of ways as him not being fit to lead a nation of men because he was not having a masculine program or he was not masculine himself. Okay, sorry, we got a pop-up right here. And so Ida B. Wells comes along, and she is a woman. She is clearly a woman, and she's attacking Booker T. Washington in the same way. But her womanness also makes her unfit to be a leader because essentially, because she is a woman, she is not able to lead a race of men. She is not fit enough just because she is happened to be born a woman or genderized as a woman, as some people would say. And I've heard Ida B. Wells say this. I watched a documentary about her on PBS, and she essentially said that much in the documentary, like, I am a woman, and I know this as such, and I am not fit to lead our race, but I'm doing the best I can, is essentially what she said, and you can hear that in the documentary. But very interesting, that the fight for who is going to lead the race was also crouched in who is the most man among us and who also has the most masculine program for us as well. So continuing here. Washington largely resisted engaging publicly in this manhood hysteria is not only a measure of his tremendous influence with the white male power structure, but also a measure of how self-consciously he distanced himself from the straitjacket of a normative masculinity, even as he comported himself respectably as a black patriarch. Refusing to engage in the public skirmish is, in effect, a way of appearing to dismiss the charges against him as beneath his cool, thus manly regard. In her study of black leadership charisma, Erica R. Edwards rightly emphasizes the ways in which black leadership has been historically constructed through and against a charismatic figure or scenario. I mean to emphasize that charisma participates in a gendered economy of political authority in which the attributes of the ideal leader are the traits American society usually conceives as rightly belonging to men or to normative masculinity, ambition, courage, and above all, divine calling. The plunking attacks on Washington indicate the extent to which Edwards' characterization of the masculinist ideal leader is certainly at work in the period's gendered economy of political authority that Washington is negotiating. At the same time, however, those characteristics of normative masculinity and the implication of dominance, control, ambitiousness, and the power associated with them are systematically withheld from African American men in order to consolidate Jim Crow's separate and unequal ideology. Ultimately, Washington understands that such a structured gender normativity is not available to him, at least if he is to avoid a violent backlash from whites that would eventually oust him from leadership. That benign, charismatic terror that Edwards describes as belonging to normative masculinity cannot be taken for granted by any would-be black male leader at the turn into the 20th century, as Washington's oratorical legerdemain, dramatic single misstep, and mass public sissy practice most vividly exemplify. So basically what he's trying to say here is a modern scholar basically sums up the idea that, of course, Booker T. Washington couldn't really deal with these, masculine politics that, the black grassroots, right? Because Booker T. Washington might have been considered, let's say, the Martin Luther King of his day, right? And, W.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells might have been, for lack of a better term, like Shahrazad Ali and Dr. Umar of the underground. You get what I'm saying? So he can't deal with these, masculine politics of the underground because they're fighting over, different cultural stuff. Meanwhile, he has to be a public face that goes into these rooms with these rich, powerful white men like the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgans and all that type of stuff. And he can't, exhibit as much masculine qualities. And his rhetoric can't be overtly masculine as well, because that is not the role that is not an ability black men have in this white supremacist society. So take it for what you will. Let's continue here. So, Sissy Housekeeping as dignified menial labor. Du Bois's charge of sapping manhood reverberates so deeply, partly because it silently rivets on that vivid image of a meticulous male housekeeper that Washington had publicized 2 years before in his popular autobiography. It is important to emphasize that for Washington's self-narration and for Du Bois's sissy-phobic intervention, the infamous sweeping incident from Up From Slavery constitutes the pivotal moment that initiates Washington's transition from boyhood to manhood. The black boy wielding a broom anticipates the image of black World War I soldiers being forced to drill with broomsticks rather than weapons, even though the Hampton classroom seems far afield from the field of battle. When he arrives at Hampton Institute, ragged and unwashed, he is told to sweep the recitation room by the school's white lady principal, Miss Mary F. Mackey. Washington communicates the obsessive quality of his sweeping as a transformative virtue that transfigures the mean, or Washington would say commonplace, menial task into a dignified site of matriculation. Basically, Booker T. Washington, escapes from slavery, or he's a newly emancipated black man. He makes it to Hampton University, and he's told to sweep the floors by a white lady there. And he, in his book, Up From Slavery, he writes this as a transformative experience for him. This is when he realized, hey, I can get ahead as long as I just work hard and put my head down and say, yes, sir, and no, sir. All right, so I knew that I could sweep, for Mrs. Ruffner had thoroughly taught me how to do that when I lived with her. I swept the recitation room 3 times. Then I got a dusting cloth and I dusted it 4 times. All the woodwork around the walls, every bench, table, and desk. I went over 4 times with my dusting cloth. Besides, every piece of furniture had been moved and every closet and corner in the room had been thoroughly cleaned. I had the feeling that in a large measure my future depended upon the impression I made upon the teacher in the cleaning of that room. As we shall see in chapter 4, James Baldwin images the sissiness of John Grimes, the 13-year-old protagonist of Go Tell It on the Mountain, through the boy's obsessive sweeping and dusting. In composing this passage, Washington is calculating the benefits of such a sissy representation against the liabilities of casting black men's labor as appropriately and perhaps intrinsically menial and subservient to a white matron's whim. As we'll discuss, however, Washington intends this formative image as transitive, for the autobiography subtly pivots toward the wizard's own patriarchal authority over his own educational institution, where ironically he will foist the same kinds of menial labor onto his female and male charges by giving orders to his own black female matrons, who occupy a position correlative to Miss Mackey. Washington makes his bond with Miss Mackey through housekeeping, a habitual way of being in an early Jim Crow environment. Like the idea that only in the South is there a man's chance, his sweeping the floor establishes the demeanor of ebullient application to menial labor that characterizes his approach to emancipation. I was one of the happiest souls on earth to pay for his schooling. Washington accepts from Miss Mackey a position as janitor. He then draws a direct connection between his janitorial work and his physical and emotional proximity to Miss Mackey. In all my career at Hampton, and ever since I have been in this world, Miss Mary F. Mackey proved one of my strongest and most helpful friends. Her advice and encouragement were always helpful and strengthening to me in the darkest hour. Miss Mackey becomes the stronger hand that Pickens theorizes is in his misrule in Haiti speech. And as we shall see, it is through his intimacy with this Yankee Schoolmarm that Washington becomes the favored protege of the white man who made the greatest and most lasting impression upon me, rising up the gender scale from being a dependent of the Yankee Schoolmarm's domestic influence to becoming a sycophant to the great white father's political power. Basically, what he's saying is that Booker T. Washington's, transformative experience of, sweeping the floor to pay his way through school really was transformative, not in the realization that, hey, with hard work and dedication and saying the right things, I can get ahead in life. It was really that, working at the behest of white people, especially at the hands of powerful white people, is really the way to get ahead. And that is really the light bulb that went off, right? And that all work, all labor that black people can do in this white supremacist capitalist system is supposed to be menial, and it's supposed to be at the behest and directed by, powerful white people. So continuing here. As Du Bois would have been embarrassingly aware, Washington has pivoted his transition to manhood on an action clearly identified with black women's subordinate status as menial laborers under the supervision of white ladies, rather than more fittingly anchoring it in a conventional masculine right like going to war or fomenting an insurrection. Du Bois picks up on this when he exploits bellicose men like the enslaved insurgents Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, and Nat Turner as the standard bearers of progressive black leadership. Dead set against the black man as warrior, the black male as housekeeper also has the misfortune of also reattaching the ideal of black male leadership to the icon of the male house slave, whose intimacy with the white master was based in the slave's subservient housekeeping role mediated by the slave mistress. From Du Bois's perspective, the figuration of the housekeeping black man poses an unmanning threat to self-assertive black progress on par with the castrating violence of white lynchers. Does it seem anachronistic to suggest that Du Bois outmuscles Washington by implying that he is a sissy, in the same way a bully might use the word today to belittle a schoolmate on the playground? Let's return to the word's etymology to sharpen this inquiry. Basically asking, is Du Bois really just being a big old bully? Which is funny because if I imagine this, I think Booker T. Washington will beat the shit out of W.B. Du Bois if they ever had that fight. You know what I mean? Both of them have transitioned to the next life. They're now the ancestors. But if they were in the physical, my money would be on Booker T. I think that man was pretty stout. He was pretty stout. And the man, the man did work with his hands. I think Booker T. Washington got better hands than W.B. Du Bois. That might be a hot take. Anyway. So let's return to the word's etymology to sharpen this inquiry. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, the epithet sissy was already in popular usage by 1887, when the New Orleans Lantern uses it to mean an effeminate person, a coward, in the phrase, look and walk too much like sissies to do much fighting. It is not surprising that the label sissy is used to make a charge of cowardice on the battlefield, whether in actual warfare or a bar skirmish between two men. The sissy is the contrary to the brave fighter. In 1889, William Dean Howells was already using the adjective sissy-ish, and the Oxford English Dictionary cites a sentence from 1905 where the more aggressive adjective sissified is used, but in quotation marks, no doubt to acknowledge it as a neologism. Given Du Bois's claim in his 1968 autobiography that he had no conception of homosexuality in 1927, it could be argued that he may have had no conception of sissiness in 1903 when he attacked Washington. The larger and more difficult question is to what extent, if at all, the sissy epithet conjured incipient homosexuality at the turn of the 20th century, as it certainly does today. Whether Du Bois was familiar with the word or not, whether it connoted homosexual deviance or not, he certainly understood the insult of gender impropriety coded by its usage, and he knew how to enforce the impact of the label's meaning in a more high-minded, one almost wants to say high-handed, manner without slinging the dirty epithet itself at Washington. By recognizing how the sycophant, a more established gender epithet in 1903, is a political synonym for sissy, a newer epithet, we can understand the gender imputation loaded in Du Bois's charge, and by highlighting the gender embarrassment entailed in Washington's fashioning of a housekeeper demeanor and practice, we can grasp how the turn-of-the-century manhood debate hinges not only on what kind of male leadership is fitting for the race, but also on what kind of labor is fitting for leading black men. Basically, what he's trying to say here is, was the entire time Du Bois criticizing Washington, he knew about the term sissy, or he had it in his mind. And Du Bois was smart enough and as great of a writer as enough that he didn't even have to say the word sissy to say Washington was a sissy. The same way Jadakiss once said to 50 Cent, you're an animal, you're an animal. You get what I'm saying? We know Jadakiss meant rat. We know Jadakiss was implying that 50 Cent was a rat. So without saying it, Jadakiss, got it in our heads that 50 Cent is a snitch. And I don't believe 50 is a snitch. I don't even care about any of that. But that's how talented of a writer Jadakiss is. Du Bois is as equally a talented of a writer. But Du Bois in 1927 said he had no idea of homosexuality. The thing is, when he was writing this about Booker T. Washington in 1903, did he know, the word sissy? And was it related to homosexuality? You get what I'm saying? Was he implying that by calling him a sycophant is what he's trying to get at. Continuing here. If Jacqueline Jones' premise that male captives actively scorned women's work and that slaveholders devised forms of public humiliation that capitalized on men's attempts to avoid these tasks is in the least bit true, then we could say that in addition to the familiar threat of black male emasculation through castration, the threat of being sissified through effeminate labor haunts black male subjectivity from the time of enslavement. I have already explained why it is theoretically instructive to hold at bay the collapsing of sissiness into homosexuality. Is there also theoretical knowledge to be gained from making a distinction between emasculation as the negating deprivation of male privates to deny masculine privilege and sissification as the denigrating reassignment of males so that they are too intimately attached to women in their presumed anatomy, affect, or labor? While Howells assumes that he is praising Dunbar by saying that the poet had lifted the race's range from mere appetite to somewhere above emotionality, such judgment of a white male poet would hardly be considered praise at all. In fact, it would seem a backhanded insult. Although not as obviously violent, the routine attachment of black men to women's social status represents a violating limit on how high even men of Washington's influence can rise in the gender-determined political and economic spheres. Such a distinction is certainly worth exploring insofar as it foregrounds the ways in which gender disidentification is historically multifariously shaped by a multifaceted political economic infrastructure, whether slavery or Jim Crow or pre-civil rights movement desegregation, which in turn helps to shape an infrastructure of feeling both as individual self-expressiveness and as collective cultural expression, like that of autobiography. Washington, having been a slave himself until the age of 9. Okay, so Booker T. Washington, I thought he was one of the new generation that was born free, right? But maybe he saw his parents enslaved. So I was wrong. Booker T. Washington really was enslaved and then ended up becoming somebody very famous and important in Black history. Okay, I was wrong. Sorry. Washington, having been a slave himself until the age of 9, would have had firsthand knowledge of this form of male gender humiliation through coerced contact with feminine labor. In Up From Slavery, Washington is careful to delineate between masculine and feminine work in lamenting the lethargic effect of slavery on the master's children. My old master had many boys and girls, he writes, but not one, so far as I know, ever mastered a single trade or special line of productive industry. The girls were not taught to cook, sew, or to take care of the house. All of this was left to the slaves. Washington's mother, according to Lewis Harlan, spent much of her day cooking not only for the master's large family, but for the slaves. We can surmise that little Booker would have lightened the burden of his mother's labor by fetching, peeling, stirring, sweeping, or other such chores accessible to a child of 6 or 7. As soon as he had grown to sufficient size, Harlan notes, Booker had the task at meal times in the master's house of fanning flies from the table. It is important to remember that the sons of house slaves were often put to use as supplementary domestic labor in the master's house, as was the case with little Booker. Slave boys to the age of puberty were often required to wear dresses indistinguishable from those worn by slave girls, such that by a certain age, the boys' genitalia might be exposed even while they stood to serve at the master's table, as if to accentuate the boy's gender misplacement as consonant with the native, natural, ordained racial order. So basically trying to say that Booker T. Washington might have been a little slave boy wearing a dress. One of the best series I've ever seen, and I wish Acty and I get to review it one day, is The Good Lord Bird. And in The Good Lord Bird, the main character is a black boy who is escaping slavery by wearing women's clothes. Now, some people look at that show and say, how come every time there's a black character, they got to put him in a dress? But in actuality, if we actually look at the history of slavery, so many things happened that we couldn't even imagine and believe. And putting black men in women's clothes is totally believable. And actually probably definitely did happen because they treated us like animals. Most of the people were working the fields naked. I know we like to see pictures and videos of historical events out during slavery and all the field hands, all the people working in the fields are fully clothed. Most of the time they were butt-ass naked, if not just wearing flat-out underwear, the bare minimum of clothing. You get what I'm saying? So basically what this text is trying to say is that Booker T. Washington, during his time enslaved, up until the age of 9, which is around the time some boys hit puberty around 9, very early, but it's possible, that Booker T. Washington could have experienced a type of gender embarrassment or gender humiliation by the slave master. So letting it be known that if he was being attacked by W.B. Du Bois for his beliefs, he would have read in between the lines. But I think also maybe we're taking for granted, people's ability to interpret those things or read in between those lines. You know what I mean? Because, even though somebody was literate back then, they're probably not as literate as somebody who reads now, I would say. Anyway, there is a crucial difference between helping one's mother in one's own household and being put out to domestic service in another's house or in a public institution. As in Washington's case when he was enslaved, or in George Washington Carver's case when he became a launderer under Northern Jim Crow. It is the public regimen of black males' intimacy with conventionally feminine labor that operates to sissify black men under the slave and Jim Crow regimes. What Sarah Ahmed observes about shame an emotion closely linked with embarrassment, might also be said about the embarrassment that derives from this kind of racial sissification. The bind of shame is that it is intensified by being seen by others as shame. Ahmed then makes out another instructive point about the material effect of shaming. The very physicality of shame, how it works on and through bodies, means that shame also involves the deforming and reforming of bodily and social spaces, as bodies turn away from others who witness the shame. What happens when this sort of exposure of a person to gender shame does not allow turning away? Does the pubescent slave boy feel shame in having his privates exposed as he fans his masters at the supper table? Or is the practice of this sort of sissifying servitude for the boy so systematically ingrained that he does not fully recognize the embarrassment intended by the master's demand? What Jacqueline Jones documents and Washington's own testimony above indicates is the extent to which enslaved men did, in fact, register gender trouble in being compelled to perform the menial work usually assigned to women in U.S. society. We can learn a lot about the gender politics of Bookerite accommodationism by analyzing how Washington, as a leader of the race, and Du Bois, as his staunchest critic, handled this gendered sense of racial embarrassment related to the sissification of black men through their compulsory public performance of menial subservient labor. The menial place of black men in the Jim Crow economy is intended to embarrass their manhood in the originary sense of impeding any passage towards heteronormative privilege and power. But this menial status also has the just as important secondary effect of the most familiar meaning of embarrass, to cause a feeling of self-conscious fluster, stuttering confusion, in the particular case as a disconcerting condition of gender disorientation, like that expressed by Du Bois in articulating the historical wastage of black manhood. The effect of embarrassment and self-embarrassment is a crucial resource for a theoretical understanding of both sissification and racial ideology. For this infrastructure of feeling, so often associated with gender and sexual impropriety, can help to prevent what typically happens when racial and sexual identities are theorized, the reduction to a binary of emasculation versus hypermasculinity, where black male identity is involved, or to a binary of shame and affirmative confession, where homosexuality is concerned, or to a binary of denial and panic, where sissiphobia and homophobia are at stake. Despite Washington's insistence that he learned his obsessive habit of housekeeping from white Yankee matrons, it is more probable that he inherited his obsessive compulsive cleanliness at his slave mother's apron strings, or under the tutelage of one of the adult male or female domestics in the master's household. By attributing his housekeeping compulsion to capable, chaste white women's tutelage instead of the school of slavery itself, Washington is able to plot black men's menial performance as a progressive rights of manhood rather than as a sissifying encumbrance to it. The larger point here, though, is that Washington's 1901 self-narration as a meticulous housekeeper would not necessarily classify him as a sissy in the eyes of his 1901 white readers. For a young white male, such housekeeping tasks would indeed signify and embody an embarrassing male person out of its proper gender place, as we shall see in the case of Samuel Chapman Armstrong, when he assigned such domestic tasks to the Negro soldiers under his charge during the Civil War. For a black male of any age, to the contrary, such domestic labor constitutes exactly his proper place under slavery, and, as Up From Slavery testifies and confirms, under white supremacist Jim Crow rule. As Sterling D. Sparrow and Abram L. Harris observe about Jim Crow labor practices, even when black and white men are engaged in similar or the same industrial labor, a distinction is maintained in order to keep black laborers subordinate to white ones, usually as helpers. The distinction between skilled and unskilled aids and abets the idea that black men's labor, like women's labor, is supplementary to white men's and thus of lower value. In addition to the economic advantage this gives to industrialists, it also reaffirms the justification for excluding black men from white men's masculine rights and rights. When we add to this that black men under Jim Crow are increasingly increasingly excluded from the craft unions whose jobs help to define the muscularity of working class white men, black male labor becomes defined as the negation of conventionally masculine labor, as well as being defined proactively as closer to supplementary feminine labor. This just reminds me of, the premise of Afro-pessimism, that basically blackness is made the antithesis to whiteness in all areas of human activity as a way to define what is actual and what is not real, what is beloved, what is hated, what is cherished, what is despised, etc. Washington's humble self-discipline of sweeping and dusting communicated to his contemporary readers, black and white, that so-called menial labor must serve as the foundation for black self-help uplift. And because menial derives from a French word meaning pertaining to a household, belonging to a retinue or train of servants. Servile, low, mean, it is perfectly fitting index of how sissification operates within the economic machinery of American racial and class politics. In other words, when Du Bois punks Washington as sapping the manhood of the race, he is declaring intellectual warfare on the long-standing assumption that black boys and men are naturally suited to do the menial work usually assigned to working class women. If slavery served as a beneficial school for both men and women, as Washington asserts, then it stands to reason that black men's subordination to the status of women's labor in this process was a crucial part of this civilizing and Christianizing education. Perhaps sissification also puts a different spin on the argument between Washington and Du Bois over the role of industrial versus liberal education, which we usually understand solely as a conflict over the role of manual versus intellectual labor. This dichotomy between manual and intellectual tends to suppress the disruptive presence of the menial, as both Du Bois's and Washington's camps insist when they speak of a belief in the dignity of labor, as Du Bois's seventh principle of the Niagara Movement Manifesto phrases it. More fundamentally and less analyzed, the repression of the menial as the source of contention founders on a gender dispute about the kind of labor appropriate for the training up of black male leaders. Du Bois does not doubt that domestic labor, that is, menial labor, is appropriate for the mass of black men and women, at least at the race's current stage of economic development. Such labor is not in and of itself undignified, as Washington repeats obsessively in Up From Slavery, in describing his efforts to enforce his own compulsive housekeeping habits on his Tuskegee students. I gotta read this book. I gotta read Up From Slavery to catch what he's saying. I know Booker T. Washington wasn't just trying to say, hey guys, we all just need to go work in the house. Slavery was bad, but that's because we all couldn't be house Negroes. That's crazy. That's a crazy premise to run with. Anyway, by sissifying Washington's identity, however, Du Bois implies that domestic service must be seen as a form of gender misplacement for those men responsible for husbanding the race. So basically, W.B. Du Bois was saying, working in the house is understandable. If you're a black person, especially a black man with not a lot of education, not a lot of resources, get any job you can if you have to work in the house. But you have to understand working in the house is not the place for a man. W.B. Du Bois was trying to say, in a traditional masculine gender type of norm, if you're a black person working as a maid to a rich white family, that is undignified work for a man. While Booker T. Washington was saying, that is the type of work we should be trying to get. Slavery wasn't that bad because not all of us were house Negroes. But now when we're free, we could all aspire to be house Negroes of some degree, right? Anyway, so by sissifying Washington's identity, however, Du Bois implies that domestic service must be seen as a form of gender displacement for those men responsible for husbanding the race. In his 1940 memoir, Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois addresses this issue as a personal dilemma that beset him and his family when he was about to complete high school. The work open to colored folk was limited, he writes. There was day labor, there was farming, there was house service, particularly in hotels. But for a young young, educated, and ambitious colored man, what were the possibilities? Day labor, farming, and house service constituted the three categories of manual labor: unskilled, industrial, agricultural, and domestic service, engaged in by the vast majority of African Americans in the late 19th century, regardless of gender. The limited options available to the gender undifferentiated mass of colored folk take on a greater urgency when the job candidate is a young, formally educated colored man coming into his manhood near the Jim Crow nadir. We have to remember how incredibly unusual it was for a colored youth, even one as extraordinary as Du Bois, to have never spent some time in some form of menial service. I mean, what he's trying to say is like, Du Bois was the outlier in this case, because most black men were doing some type of menial, low-skilled labor that was demeaning in a traditionally masculine world. Actually, very briefly after graduating from Fisk, Du Bois takes a job that easily could be classified as menial and domestic. Notice how Du Bois is quick to distinguish his own role from that of the other young male Fisk graduates. After graduation, the members of the Fisk Glee Club went to Lake Minnetonka, a resort in Minnesota, for the summer of 1888, with the idea of working in the dining room and giving concerts. I was to act as their business manager. During college, I had developed rather as the executive and planner, the natural secretary of affairs, rather than ornamental president and chairman. The only difficulty about the Minnesota excursion was that I had never worked in a hotel in my life. I could not wait on table, therefore became one of the busboys. It was so unusual a pageant to watch the dining room that I made no tips and for a long time had difficulty getting enough to eat, not realizing that in the day, servants in great hotels were not systematically fed but foraged for food in devious ways. I saw the Americans, rich and near rich, at play. It was not inspiring. The servility necessary for the successful waiter, I could not or would not learn. Interesting. All right. Going here, continuing here. By disidentifying with domestic service, both in raising his status to business manager and in portraying himself as totally unsuitable to the deviousness and subservience, in other words, sycophancy, required of being a busboy, Du Bois communicates that such labor is beneath him. Black male identity in the early 20th century was cemented to domestic service, whether in public institutions like the Pullman rail car, the street corner shoe shine, the hotel dining room, the elevator operator, or the private household. What would normally be seen to be an embarrassment, the demotion from waiter to busboy, italics added, turns out for Du Bois to be exculpatory, for he succeeds at being so inept at this menial labor that he cannot survive doing it. I suspect that would not learn is a more accurate turn of phrase than could not learn. And Du Bois's waffling between the two amplifies his willfulness versus his ineptness. Despite Du Bois's extraordinary intention of foiling the economic infrastructure of black male Jim Crow identity by refusing and repudiating effeminate domestic service, he cannot, in the end, protect himself from being incorporated into this identity. When he is at Harvard, he makes a point of escorting the prettiest colored girls to the university's official social events, where he is put back in his proper gender place among the menials by a stray white lady. Naturally, we attracted attention and sometimes the shadow of insult, as when in one case a lady seemed determined to mistake me for a waiter. This shadow of insult stings deep enough for Du Bois to remember and single it out half a century later in composing his memoir. Despite Du Bois's status as a Harvard student and his often noted air of arrogance, his deportment as a young man ready to conquer the world seems ineligible to the random white lady. Or more likely, she deliberately mistakes him for the waitstaff to put him back in his racial place through an insult that operates through gender embarrassment. We should not fail to make the palpable connection between the image of menial male domestic labor and sycophancy. Part of what Du Bois experiences as humiliating about the insult at Harvard social events concerns the idea that to be a menial is to be a lick spittle, the servility necessary for the successful waiter, as someone who must curry favor subserviently as an Uncle Tom from the whites whom he is serving. When Du Bois aims his shadow of insult at Washington, then the self-portrait of dignified manly labor that Washington promotes in the housekeeping entrance exam devolves into the now familiar servile, unmanly, and cowardly practice that we associate embarrassingly with the great accommodator. Even if Washington could have anticipated Du Bois's sissifying attack, there is not much he could have done to forestall it. The historical, political, and economic circumstances of Jim Crow that Washington hoped to manipulate for the benefit of his race dictated that he image and plot his coming of age through male menial service. In an attempt to advance beyond Du Bois's decidedly embarrassing understanding of the sissy resonance in Washington's sweeping passage, Houston Baker Jr. uses Mary Douglas and queer theory to argue that Washington's compulsive sweeping secures Yankee access to the Yankee woman's purity without exposing him to the danger of lynching. According to this interpretation, Washington is ironically both a victim of racially enforced neurotic impulse beyond his psychic control and simultaneously a sly operator capable of psychologically manipulating superior whites toward his own erotic advantage. Why does everything come back to white cooch? Not everything revolves around white cooch. Snow bunnies never, black queens forever. Black queens forever, snow bunnies never. Baker's reading renders the Wizard of Tuskegee, whether tragic victim or sexual master, implicitly heroic and, as such, conventionally masculine in his heteronormative drive to possess the untouchable white lady without polluting her with a beastly blackness. This is chivalry through the back door of the white man's house. While appearing to have moved beyond Du Bois's sissifying attack, Baker actually exculpates Washington's gender embarrassment by ironically reinforcing the black leader's heteronormativity. What would most scandalize Washington's readers is not that he might be an effeminate, cowardly sissy, or even that he might be a homosexual. Only God knows what emasculation will do to a black man's gender identity. But instead that his humble menial labor might cloak a seduction of chaste white womanhood. Of course, Washington's white readers would be eager to accept the idea that even the humblest black servant conceals within him a rapist of white womanhood. However, this premise is exactly what Washington's self-narration is intended to contravene. Washington takes great pains to desex his narrative, that is, to suppress any hint that there might be any implication of sexual conduct at all, not because he is secretly horny for Yankee white women's flesh, and Baker rests some of his argument on that notion that, contrary to stereotype, the Yankee Schoolmarms were young, vivacious, and very pretty indeed. Instead, as I have argued elsewhere, the act of desexing a narrative under Jim Crow is motivated by a desire to refocus the public's attention on the appropriate political and economic objects and ambitions of racial uplift at a time when white supremacy insisted on scandalizing black men's sexuality by always reducing it to an uncontrollable, savage appetite for chaste white ladies. To reduce Washington's sweeping mania to an erotic performance of a racial taboo risks abnegating what is most substantive about his self-narration, the political, ideological, and propagandist negotiation of Jim Crow disenfranchisement. In the eagerness to flip the script to an erotic interest, we tend to repress the overriding political and economic agenda, anchoring the wizard's sissy impersonation. More to the point for our purpose here, to view Washington's cleaning compulsion as an interracial erotic subtext is to repress again the non-erotic, that is, the non-normative gender connotation of a sissified affiliation, so much at stake in Washington's autobiography, and especially in its reception then and now. Yeah, definitely. I cannot see, Booker T. Washington cleaning the white man's house to have sexual access to white women doesn't make sense. And if that is supposed to be, somebody's narrative, that's a wild take. That's a very wild take. That's a bad take that didn't even deserve a paragraph. I don't even know why Marlon decided to write about that. That's crazy. Don't even write about that. Anyway, I think the greater historical and cultural import of Washington's apparent self-sissification lies in how he exploits autobiography to transliterate the lowliness of domestic menial labor into high-minded intellectual discourse. It is easy to miss this ingenious and ingenuous legerdemain, as with the case of his building a classical campus for higher education at Tuskegee while appearing merely to accede to a supplementary industrial education for its students. So he deploys the self-humbling protocols of 19th century autobiography, instead to position himself as a legitimate interlocutor in the highest intellectual debates of his time. Picturing himself deep in the mud to help make bricks to build the campus, Washington at the same time raises himself to the status of an international public intellectual, notwithstanding his diatribes against book learning. The ideas he proffers, many borrowed from Samuel Chapman Armstrong and others, were distinctly his own. The Tuskegee model of industrial education becomes so strongly identified as Washington's original ideas that as these ideas travel abroad, Tuskegee becomes a mecca for those in Asia, Africa, Central, and South America. Both Claude McKay and Marcus Garvey, two important shapers of the Harlem Renaissance, migrate to the United States from Jamaica, like thousands of nameless others, to study Tuskegee's successes and to matriculate at the internationally famed institution. Ironically, from his self-portrait as a sissy housekeeper who justifies the menial labor of African Americans as the basis for their education, Washington steals his intellectual chops as America's leading black educator of his time. Okay, so basically, what I take from this, interpretation of Up From Slavery and the criticism that was drawn from it, I take that, number one, I need to read the book because this book has been like on bookshelves all my life that I've been near and I never picked it up and read it. So I need to read Up From Slavery. And I just take it that, some of our ancestors had to make sacrifices. And some of them probably had to do things that we would frown at now today. But back then, the first cowboy over the hill gets all the Indians' arrows, right? So take it for what you will. Booker T. Washington is still an amazing man. I'm not going to disrespect him. But, I do think some of his ideas about black capitalism and lifting yourselves up by your bootstraps definitely have not worked. And they should not be the main strategy or tactic that we use going forward in our battle against white supremacy. Continuing here. The fastidious black body as fetish. Washington has to find ways of displaying and disseminating his own habits and words, images, and body gestures that can be appreciated by his superiors and easily emulated by his students, disciples, and political dependents. Obsessive cleanliness reminds him that he can be a Negro, the descendant of slaves and formerly enslaved himself, without being doomed to the captive condition that has prevented him from properly owning and caring for his own body. Although a punctilious obsession with cleanliness is sometimes affiliated with a sissy sensorium, a man not willing to get his hands dirty, Washington negotiates this fetish for cleanliness so that it communicates both a sign of his racial humbleness and a promise of upward social mobility. While a fear of dirty labor might indicate a sissy demeanor, ironically, those men who can avoid such labor in this socioeconomic system, workers later to be dubbed white collar as opposed to blue, are more highly ranked. Indeed, part of what determines the class status of the white men who rule is that they have the means to hire others to do such work for them, whether on their estates or in their factories. In her study, Imperial Leather, Anne McClintock identifies exactly how a fetish, marking what she calls a crisis in social meaning, can function in a socio-political register before Freud's focus on the individual psyche. Though in a surface sense, Washington's fetish object is the smudge of his own body and the utensils and commodities that enable cleaning up, the toothbrush representing the most famous instance, and the broom the crucial, most understudied instance. In a more profound sense, Washington enacts a fetish ritual without a discrete fetish object. What he is obsessed with is not the token color of his own skin, but rather pedagogical, propagandistic procedures for finding and showing ways to manage white people's oppressive obsession with skin color. It is not the totemic power of the broom or toothbrush as objects in themselves that he worships, his notion of the gospel of the toothbrush, but instead the empowering social practices of hygiene, which can teach racial pride and economic parity to a people negatively stigmatized as belonging to the dirt that defines their labor. So basically saying here, Washington wasn't obsessed with just sweeping and brooming and doing menial labor. He was obsessed with the idea that this type of labor, if done, intentionally and with a focused sense, could instill racial pride in a people that have been broken in all types of ways, is what he's trying to get at here. So, All right. So, by Washington's time, home economics has been clearly articulated as the province of white middle-class women, whose professionalization as domestic managers of the household is subordinate to white men's proper political and economic rule in the public sphere. For Washington, home economics serves as a self-conscious process of education appropriate to the male leader of a subordinated race, which, like white women, lacks economic and political authority in the public sphere. It is a haggling relation that he and other Black Americans can manage, for it sparks the explosive potential within the impossible imputation connecting Black skin to filth, transforming that imputation into evolutionary behavior, while accepting the historical association of Black skin with dirt and Negro status with abject menial labor in the Black soil of the Black Belt. Washington seeks to turn this degradation against itself, just as he turns sycophantic ingratiation into common labor at the bottom in every manly way. Revising Freud's take on the role of soap as a civilizing agent, Peter Stalybras and Alan White have pointed out how the value of cleanliness arises out of a need for the rising middle class to segregate itself from the degraded masses in response to the accelerated pace of industrial capitalism and urbanization occurring in 19th century Britain. Those able to afford the aggressively marketed new commodities of manufactured cleaning agents like soap can make a claim for belonging to an upwardly mobile class. Being able to do work that does not get one dirty further separates the professionalizing middle class from increasing numbers of urban industrial workers, not far removed from the soil of agricultural labor. By the late 19th century, the American middle class occupies an ambivalent status similar to its British counterpart. As Stuart M. Blumen has documented, the elusive American middle class forms its identity through a dualistic attitude toward manual labor. On the one hand, celebrating the dignity of work in the Puritan tradition. On the other hand, defining upward mobility as a movement away from manual labor and its accompanying grime. At the same time that the white male laborer represents genuine manliness, according to Blumen, he is frequently characterized in a subhuman fashion. Sun-darkened skin and dirty and tattered clothes, along with rough hands, mental sluggishness, and even an ape-like or otherwise bestial character or carriage were fairly common elements in the depiction of manual workers at mid-century. Blumen's study does not connect this dark, sluggish, subhuman figure to the stereotype of African American men that dominates the 19th century. It is exactly the image of recently emancipated men that Washington aims to controvert through lessons in bodily hygiene, house cleaning, and the wise management of money and material goods, all characteristics of good housekeeping. Good here signifies for Washington not merely the proper conduct of a housekeeper, but also self-evident proof of pure moral character. Quite literally, Washington wants to turn the white man's notion of the good Negro into a political economic practice of racial self-help, the dignity of menial labor transformed into the resourcefulness of uplifting entrepreneurship, to maneuver the good Negro from menial subservience to running factories in every manly way. Washington must pivot illustrated this transformation through the image of the too good sissy boy, figured autobiographically as himself at the outset of his college matriculation. Daniel T. Rogers also points to the contradiction between the work ethic and the injunction to work one's way as quickly as possible out of manual toil, but further suggests that behind the contempt for industrializing manual labor is another evasion. Behind all the other terms for the worker who labored at the will and for the profit of another was the oldest, bluntest, and most troubling word of all, slave. Seeing both slaveholders and the enslaved as morally disfigured by a system that seems to encourage idleness as well as degraded drudgery, many Northerners of the 19th and early 20th centuries attempt to depict the slave economy as a nightmarish inversion of Northern work values. It was necessary to insist, Rogers writes, all the more adamantly that the North was different, that it was a land where labor was not only respected but genuinely free. The black mass represents the indignity of labor, both as a slave caste burdened with the drudgery of unfree labor and immobile status, and as a racial group untutored in the Yankee work ethic and thus prone as much to idle lethargy as to unprofitable static drudgery. Blacks and workers at leisure are represented as naturally lazy, as opposed to the increasing emphasis on white middle-class men so busy with work that they fully deserve leisure time to prevent work illnesses, like neurasthenia. The right to the spoils of capitalist industry is based on a racial ideology of thrifty Yankee know-how and individualism, an ideology also implicit, we shall see, in the conception of America's colonial mission. Because the races are naturally unequal, those unfortunates born into an inferior race would have to enact even greater self-discipline to rise above the race's more polluted condition. Hence the obsessive nature of Washington's hygienic fetish ritual. This native pollution of the black body is further intensified in the notion of its different smell, a theory of racial difference that can be traced at least as far back as Thomas Jefferson's 1785 Notes on the State of Virginia. The sense of smell is especially revealing insofar as it exposes the ways in which an ethos of gender conduct hinges on the body as a legible vector of judgment. The vector of smell enables us to see the limits on conduct as a racially enabling resource of gender fluidity. As Washington strongly believes, a ritual habit of hygiene can change one's perception of oneself and thus others' perception. The challenge derives from the fact that any person immersed in the kinds of menial labor that Washington extols, including the labor of cleaning others' domestic spaces, makes it impossible to maintain a pristine body. Rather than a ladder that enables uplift, the practice of committing to dirty labor, followed by a rigorous hygiene of cleaning up, will instead become a Sisyphean trap. Basically, you get dirty by doing dirty work, even if this dirty work is going to somehow uplift you. An overly fastidious bodily practice is also implicated in gender suspicion, insofar as men who are too attentive to their bodies can be perceived as sissies, such as those who smell too sweet, like the image of perfumed pansies scattered in turn-of-the-century literature. The gender jeopardy of an overly fastidious man is further complicated by the way in which an obsession with hygiene may do little to overcome the racial prejudice that equates blackness with an innate and thus indelible stink. Sometimes racial smell is seen as scientific fact, as in the case with the influential white Chicago sociologist Robert E. Park, Washington's ghostwriter beginning in 1905. Following Jefferson, I did not know that Robert E. Park was Booker T. Washington's ghostwriter. Following Jefferson 100 years earlier, Park writes, at any rate, it seems to be a fact that races and individuals have each a distinct smell, and this odor becomes, in certain cases, the sensuous basis for racial antipathies. Basically, I'm sure Robert E. Park pops up in one of my sociology classes, and I wish I Googled this racist motherfucker so I could raise this up in class. But yeah, The peculiar stench of black bodies remains both proof and rationale at the most visceral level in the South for the natural segregation of the races, and as referenced in the study that Charles S. Johnson conducted for the Chicago Commission on Race Relations following the 1919 Chicago race riots. It becomes one of the explanations for the tensions between black migrants and white residents in the urban North. Basically, because black people smell different, which we don't, there are some people that are musty. And a lot of times mustiness is related to poverty because you don't have, the money to take baths or buy soap, right? Whatever. Anyway, it becomes one of the explanations for the tensions between black migrants and white residents in the urban North. Washington's emphasis on meticulous washing of the black body as the basis for modern uplift, therefore, cannot be separated from the way he and others understand racial disadvantage to operate through these gut-level senses of smell and touch. And in turn, these senses cannot be separated from a gender dynamic in which men of the upper classes are protected from the stench of manual labor. Leading white men have their wives and their wives have their maids to ensure their cleanliness, even beyond the fact that white patriarchs are not required to labor in the fields, mills, mines, and factories that they own and oversee. Washington has often been read as a self-made black man who mimics and remolds the famous robber barons of the period. I do not so much want to question this characterization as to highlight the kinds of racial, sexual, and gender irregularities that result from Washington's impersonation or mimicry of the fabled great white man. He moves along an axis from emulation and saintly white Yankee made of his white male mentor, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, through the triangulated mediation of marriage to middle-class mulatto women of virtually unimpeachable chastity. What Washington fashions is not exactly feminization, which implies some degree of social coercion, as this has been defined in the scholarship, but effeminization, whereby he seems voluntarily to embrace black men's coerced affiliation with women's subordination status. As we shall see, powerful white men like Samuel Chapman Armstrong, while enacting a rhetoric of feminization, end up exerting their power over black people, not to mention over others, in conventionally masculine ways, while the threat of feminization, especially if it is prolonged or gains priority over a man's development, breeds a fear of emasculation in a man like Armstrong. It also feeds his hunger for an imperialist vocation, coded both as manly frontier adventure and as interested, patronizing service to a less fortunate race. While Washington voluntarily occupies a housekeeping role, and while his fastidious cleaning up of the race still effectuates a distinctly masculine grab for dominance as a racial patriarch, he does not depict himself as developing beyond this housekeeping status to claim an unqualified right to the masculine norm occupied by white supremacy. As can be seen in epigraphs to this chapter, Washington's stepfather and Du Bois both distanced themselves from housekeeping, even though the line separating men's labor from women's was very much deliberately blurred for African Americans during slavery and after. In aligning his character and conduct with women's menial domesticity that others, like his own stepfather and his rival Du Bois, eschew, Washington puts himself at risk of being charged with unmanning the race while ironically assuming housefatherly leadership of it. All right, so we're going to wrap it up here with the Wizard's Three Wives. We're going to read this section next time. But basically, it made me think about a lot of things, this section. Booker T. Washington's legacy, what it means to try to have black self-empowerment and upliftment, and what are the implications of that? Is that a type of sissification? Because conventionally, when we think of Booker T. Washington or any other person who says black people need to come together, support black businesses, build our own communities and stuff like that, it's not asking what type of labor are we doing? How exploitative is this labor? Is this labor menial? And if it is menial, what does that mean to masculinity in black men? Right? So I find this very fascinating. We're going to pick here the Wizard's Three Wives. I didn't know Booker T. Washington was married 3 times, if that's where this book is going. But looking forward to reading that. We're going to continue reading this tomorrow. for another hour-long live stream like we always do, as we slowly chip away at this very powerful, very deep, very dense book. And looking forward to hearing more from what y'all have to say out there. Be easy. We will read all the comments under the book reacts every time, and catch y'all tomorrow. Peace.